leaders that have integrity to them. Yeah, brilliant. Well, yeah, trusting the people we can trust. People that we can trust. That's really important as well. What else comes to mind? Any more? Go on, Peter. Yeah. Good. So people who stick at it and be kind of faithful to what they were called to do. There's another question that comes off this, though. We think about human leaders. Here's another question that we're going to think about today. It's this. What kind of king, what kind of leader, what kind of king should God's king be? If God was going to have a king, what should they be like? Because this bit of 1 Samuel that Lizzie read for us, it tells us of God's king. And as it does so, as it paints that picture of Saul as king, it wants us to cast our eyes forward, if you like, to Jesus, to the far distant future as it was for this, to Jesus who would come as the king of God's people. And the bits we see in this passage about Saul actually tell us something about Jesus, the king who was to come later. So let's look at 1 Samuel, because this is the king, this is God's king, the king that we need. It tells us what the king is like. And in some ways, actually, with Saul here in 1 Samuel, it starts pretty badly, although it does get better from here. Because the first thing I think we need a king who is willing. I'll let you do it because this isn't working. There we go. We need a king who is willing, not hiding amongst the boxes. I think verses 22 and 23 of this passage are perhaps my favourite of this section, if nothing else for their comedy value. But they're both funny, if you like, on the one hand, and actually not really funny at all on the other. Verse 22 of chapter 10 said this. So the people, they inquired again of the Lord. They were looking for Saul, his name had been drawn out a hat, as it were. Is there a man still to come? And the Lord said, behold, he's hidden himself among the baggage. Saul's name has come out of the hat, and they're looking for Saul to make him king, and they can't find him anywhere. So they have to go back to God and say, where is he? God says, look, he's over there. He's amongst the suitcases and the camels. Is it funny or is it not funny? Saul, this giant of a man, is trying to hide in the bags because he knows that the lot is going to fall on him. He knows where this is going because Samuel has already anointed him as the king. He's told him this is going to happen. But Saul, you get the sense that he doesn't want to be king, does he? So he goes and folds himself up among all the bags and hides away. Here we have a king to be, running away from what God has called him to do, not wanting to follow after God. I wonder if he has a sense, Saul, at this moment, of all the difficulties being king would mean. Sometimes we think being in charge, being the king, would be a great thing and a wonderful thing. Think of all the things we could do. But yet I wonder if Saul has recognized the difficulties, the pressures, the challenges which would actually follow. And so as Saul runs away to hide, he's actually saying to God, no, not me. Choose someone else. It was interesting earlier in our all-in slot with Simon. Doesn't it sound a bit like Jonah? God says to him, go to Nineveh, and what does he do? He runs in the opposite direction before the Lord brought him back. This is the start, if you like, of the signs of however good Saul is, however much of a great king he becomes, that actually he's never going to be the perfect king. Because one of the things I think we learned today is that God needs a willing king. A king willing to follow God wholeheartedly in the difficult things, in the hard things, in the uncertainty. I get Saul as I read this. I really do get Saul. I get the anxiety. I get the pressure, the not wanting to be at the centre and at the top. But if God's people are going to follow the Lord, then they need a king who is going to follow the Lord. Saul wasn't willing to say, Lord, not my will, but yours be done. We need a willing king. Every king from this point onward in Israel's history failed in some regard. They all failed somewhere along their journey, however good or bad they were on the whole, because they're all shadows of the king to come, Jesus. Jesus, the king who wouldn't fail at any point. And Jesus, he was the willing king, wasn't he? He didn't come reluctantly to us to earth from heaven, but he delighted to do so. He came wanting to be our king, to lead us, to protect us, to rescue us. Jesus hasn't come to you reluctantly. All through his life, even in the face of opposition, in the face of temptation, Jesus says that he willingly comes to do the things that his Father has given him to do. One place we see it is in John 10, where Jesus, our King, says he will willingly die for us because he and his Father have the same will and desire to rescue. Listen to John 10, verses 17 and 18. It says this, it's Jesus speaking. He says, "For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up. This charge I have received from my Father." Jesus is your willing king. He doesn't love you, lead you, and die for you with a sense of kind of reluctance. He isn't being dragged out of the suitcases and the boxes. But no, he comes for you willingly. Next, what else do we see? Well, we need a king who will follow God. Saul in our passage, he wasn't a king who had absolute authority to act exactly how he wanted. He had rights, it says, and duties that were given to him by Samuel on behalf of God. Look at verse 25 where you see it. Then Samuel told the people the right and duties of the kingship, and he wrote them in a book and laid it up before the Lord. Then Samuel sent all the people away, each one to his own home. Any leaders, even a king at the top of the tree, doesn't have authority to lead however they want, because they all do it under God. They do get certain benefits, don't they? Certain freedoms that they enable them to lead. And they get duties, things they have to do, things they're called to do to honour and follow God. It's true of every level of leadership in every sphere of life. It just takes on different forms. Here there was clarity over what Saul was to do. It was told to all the people, so they knew as well. It was written down, and it came from the Lord. God here, as he gives Israel a king, he's not completely taking his hands off the steering wheel of the life of Israel. He's still holding on to it because he's instructing his king. A good king would always be a man after God's own heart. Someone who would follow him, who would act as he acted. Someone, as some of you were saying earlier, who has the character that reflected God. Think for a moment of all the bad leaders that you've experienced over the years, with their perhaps so obvious character flaws, their errors of judgment, their sinfulness. Think of your own failings in those areas. Don't you long for a king who would be different? Even if you do make yourself king because you're fed up with everyone else, thinking, you know what? I know best. I can do I'm going to choose what I do. I don't need or want anyone to tell me what's going on. You quickly learn that you're not as good a king as you thought you would be. That you too have character flaws. That you too have your own sin. That sometimes what you're absolutely adamant would be best turns out not to be. For the arrows and youth here, if you've lost the thread, just listen up for a moment. Because you are at that stage of life, if you like, where you're going to be given more freedom to choose to do what you want to do. You're going to be allowed to make many more of your own decisions because you're moving from being a child towards being a young adult. You get more of the opportunities that will come with that. So now is a really good time to start thinking actually about who are you going to follow? Who will be king, if you like, in your life? Because that will be a choice you will have to make in the following years over and over and over again. Who are you going to listen to when it comes to knowing what is right and wrong? Who are you going to listen to when it comes to knowing what to do with your life, what school to go to, what university to go to, what course to pick? Who are you going to follow and who are you not going to follow? Up to this point, your parents will have largely chosen, won't they, for you? They'll have controlled that. But you are now going to have to start to choose for yourself more and more. And if it becomes friends or teachers, parents, or even yourself who you make king, they will at some point fail you. There is only one person in this life who was a king, who is a leader to follow, who won't let you down, who won't get it wrong, who will always be consistent and faithful to you, whatever life brings. And that's Jesus. He is the king who honors God and he loves you. You might not always understand or even agree with everything that he says is right and wrong. You might find what Jesus says to you as king is different to the world around you. But he is the one to follow. He is the one who always does what is right, who always honors God and who will always love you. Who you follow is a choice you're going to have to make over and over again. But always know you can come back to Jesus as king. That takes us, I think, nicely on to the next thing we see in 1 Samuel. This is an odd one. God's king will divide people. Not everyone will follow him. Even some of those you'd expect to, who will be part of Israel. We might find this difficult because I think in our heads and our hearts sometimes we expect God's king, if he does things rightly, to bring everybody together. To bring a kind of unity where there be no division. Surely God's king would be so obviously right, so obviously good, that everyone would be willing to turn and follow him and gather round. And it's that way of thinking that actually reaches down into every level of leadership. Think about the times you've thought or heard, and I've heard it. People say, if we just had person X as the prime minister or as the boss at work or as our church leader, then it would bring people together. Everybody would rally round. But even with the best king there could be, that's not how it works. Because as people, we are all broken and sinful. Amongst Israel, here in 1 Samuel, there are people who see Saul and they think, that's not the king we wanted. How can he be God's king? What's he going to do? Look at verse 27. But some worthless fellow said, how can this man save us? And they despised him and brought him no present. But he held his peace. Popularity by itself isn't a marker for God's king. Saul divides people from the off. Some people, on one hand, they're crying out, aren't they? God save the king. And others reject him. And these are people you'd expect to all be on side. It's not the other nations rejecting Saul, but God's own people. The people of Israel who'd cried out not long ago to God for a king. It's them who don't want him. The mark of a good king and a good leader isn't that they are universally liked by everybody. Doing good, doing the right things, doesn't always mean people will respond as they should. It was true for Saul, and it was true for Jesus, our king, years later. Some of Jesus' most vocal critics were those who were part of Israel. God's king separates, he divides those who will follow him and honour him and those who won't. Why? Well, I think we see some of that here in Samuel. Because God's king isn't always the kind of king we want. God's king doesn't always look to us like the kind of king we think we need. And so we need to be careful here when it comes to Jesus, don't we? Because he often won't look, and often doesn't, as we read the Gospels, look like the kind of king or ruler we see around us. He rarely looks the part. He goes through his life, doesn't he, seeking out the weak, the forgotten, the rejected. He finishes his earthly life at one level as a man mocked, beaten, crucified. And this is our king. A king who divides, who some will reject because when they look at Jesus, he just doesn't seem to offer what they want. And we have to expect that. Yet, despite not seeming to be the right kind of king for some people, God's king is a king who saves. He's a king who saves. Verse 11, the Ammonites surround one of Israel's towns in our readings, don't they? And the people of that town of Jabesh, they send someone out to go and say, they send messengers out to see if somebody will rescue them. Somebody will come to their aid. And when the news gets to Saul, he is outraged. To the extent that he cuts up some of his ox and sends bits of ox, if you like, all around Israel, saying, look, if you don't come and help me rescue these people, this is what I'm going to do to your oxen as well. What we see here is a rescue mission. And I always imagine it, in my head, this is going back some years, but it's like the key scene from the film Gladiator, where Russell Crowe is kind of standing with the armies behind him, and he is going to go into battle. That's what I imagine this was like, for a glorious victory. And that's basically what Saul does. Driven by the Holy Spirit, Saul, God's king, he travels from the safety and the peace of where he was in his hometown into battle to rescue those who've been taken captive. Whatever else we can say of Saul, he was a rescuer of those who are potentially heading towards a horrible death. He was a king who went and risked his life for others on the front line. And as you read it, don't you see so clearly the echoes of God's final King Jesus? I mean, who does this sound like from Luke 4? We had it read earlier. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. What we see so vividly in the story of Saul as he rides in to rescue these people is what Jesus came to fulfill as our King. He has brought freedom to us. He has rescued us. He has saved us. He has brought us into his kingdom. We must never, ever forget this about Jesus. We sing, what a friend we have in Jesus, and so we do. But Jesus can't ever be just a friend. He can't ever be just a nice person we follow. He can't ever be just a role model. None of those are good enough for what we need. We need a king who comes to save us and rescue us. Without Jesus, we are like the people of Jabesh, encircled, surrounded with no escape. But Jesus is the one who comes as king to rescue us from death's clutches and to bring us new life, to give us our freedom. Have you lost sight, perhaps, in your life of that just a little bit? It's often one of those truths, and I found this for me, it's a truth that can be so precious at first, when you first turn to Jesus as King. Yet as life rolls on, is so easily forgotten or taken for granted amongst all the pressures of life and all the other things that are going on. It's like when you move into a new house and you look around and you walk through rooms and you think, what a wonderful gift. This is a joy. You imagine what it would look like to live there. It's such a blessing. You can't think of anything better. But then as the weeks and the months roll on, it becomes less significant. Other things become more important. It takes on a lesser role in your life, and you kind of take it for granted. You start to forget the things you loved about it at first, the things that were most important. Sometimes it can be like that with Jesus as King. It was so precious, so important, such a joy at first. But amongst everything else, it has become lost. God's King is a King who saves, and he has saved us. But here we go. We also need a King who offers grace. What does a king do? I said the king divides. God, king divides. What does that king do when people reject him? What did Saul do? Well, Saul offers the people who reject him a reprieve, a chance to change their mind and choose to follow him. Look at verse 13 of chapter 11. This is Saul after he's won the battle. The people want to kill those who've complained and stood against Saul. They want to put them to death because that is what you did with people who stood against the king and lost. But Saul, in this moment, he recognized that God is the one who's really rescued them this day. So despite their rejection of him, so he takes that approach. He forgives them. He shows them mercy, as we were thinking about earlier. Look at verse 13. But Saul said, "Not a man shall be put to death this day. For today the Lord has worked salvation in Israel." The way kings used to work in the past was like politics today, but with more killing. So nowadays, if you kind of are in government or have been an MP and you back the wrong candidate for a post and for Prime Minister, then when the cabinet shuffle kind of comes around, you are not getting a new post. You are shoved to the back benches, out of sight and out of the way. And that's what kings would have done in the old time. But they wouldn't have just shoved you to the back benches. They'd have killed you and buried you somewhere out of the way. But Saul here doesn't respond like every other king. He offers grace and mercy to those who publicly rejected him. For them, there will be another day and another opportunity for them to accept him as king. When our King Jesus was dying on the cross, when he was being crucified by those who rejected him, he said these remarkable words. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," and they cast lots to divide his garments. Forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Has a king ever shown more grace to those who are rejecting him than this? Has any king ever before longed for and offered a chance to come back and follow him as king, as Jesus did that moment when he was being crucified and killed by them? In whatever ways you might have rejected Jesus as king, in the things you have done, in the words you've said, in the other kings that you followed instead, picture that scene of Jesus hanging on the cross, wanting his Father to offer forgiveness to those who are killing him at that moment. Jesus wants us to know that his grace, so that we can turn back to him. For now there is mercy and grace. For now you are not too far away. You have not rejected him to the point that he doesn't want you anymore. For today is a day when the Lord is working salvation amongst his people. What do we do as we finish with a king like this? Jesus is a graceful, willing king who both divides people and saves people. That means that for us, following Jesus as king is both a joy and a delight, and yet often difficult at the same time. It's difficult because sometimes he's not the kind of king that we'd want, because of how he looks, because he divides people, because he follows his Father faithfully, and perhaps even because he sometimes offers grace to people that we don't want him to. Sometimes it's difficult because we'd rather be kings of our own lives. But this story in 1 Samuel of Saul is a picture of the rescue that we have in Jesus. Doesn't it just cast your mind back to that time when you first believed in Jesus, when you were first saved, when you first knew that rescue of yourself, the freedom, the joy, the hope, in the middle of everything else in life, when trying to work out how simply to get through the next day or the next week seems overwhelming, when there are a million things going round your head, when you see your sin too clearly or illness has you in its grip, it can be so easy to seek after another king. to forget who Jesus is and what he's done. But there is no other king like Jesus. Even Saul, anointed by God, had his failings, and every other king has their failings. But Jesus willingly laid down his life to save us. And he calls us to follow after him, to have him as our king, to be his people and to be part of his kingdom. To live the way he calls us to, worshipping, praising and celebrating him as king. And so I want you to have a chance to think about that, perhaps after we finish, when we drink tea and coffee or at another point. And I have 2 questions for you to think about. So we do that, which will be on the screen. Oh, they're very small. These are my 2 questions. Perhaps find someone to chat about them with. What area of your life might change with Jesus as king of it? Are there parts of your life which actually don't follow Jesus in, where he isn't king, someone or something else is? What parts of your life do you need to make Jesus king in again? And if Jesus was king in those parts of life, what would it look like? What would change? Maybe we'll stick those on the screen at the end as well for you. But what we're going to do now is we are going to praise and we are going to sing and we are going to worship our King because he is so worth it. So let's stand and let's sing together.